This is a sad day for our city. Hopefully, these people will go home, and the people who invited them here, maybe they should leave with them.
We came to stand with people who were very righteously standing up against, white supremacy.
Only the power of the people!
Mob mentality, or what you call mob wisdom, pack mentality, gang mentality, mob psychology. There are many different kinds of ways that we have characterized what happens when people get together. What happened, what culminated in the August 12, 2017 conflict in Charlottesville was the effort to dismantle the statue of General Robert E. Lee.
This mobs in the street kind of activity, the Charlottesvilles in 2017 kind of activity. Who's more likely to engage in that are, people who are dissatisfied with society. They feel some sense of grievance. They feel, that they're very, upset about the way things are going on.
Sometimes when you hear that a mob behavior has been exhibited and you start looking at people involved in it, and you're like, oh, but that's a good kid. How could he get involved in this? That's not like him. You hear things like that. It's just because that individual has yielded, and taken on the character of that group.
As bad as those guys are, that they should be free to say what they wish on public property.
Has a right to be there, just like everything else. If we can abolish that and erase slavery too.
Virginia was a southern state during it was part of the Confederacy, and just taking away monuments, as even if people see that they're bad, I wouldn't support that.
So the city council voted to have it removed and to rename the park, right? So different groups, Richard Spencer, neo-Nazi groups, they were holding protests to stop that from happening. So this particular August 12th protest that was scheduled kind of triggered an anti-protest group, a counter-protest group, and that was how the whole thing went out of hand. I think it develops when there is that group dynamic. People lose their individuality and get absorbed into that group mindset.
White supremacy, as the name suggests, just the belief that whites are a superior group and other groups are drastically more inferior and don't deserve the same treatment and rights as whites do, that whites should dominate and others should be subordinate.
We're getting all the worst of the worst out here today, so we're just here to make sure that the people who aren't associated with those groups are kept safe, and like I said, everybody gets to say what they want to say and get it off their chest, and they can go home safe at the end of the day.
Every society has some degree of inequality, and that's part of the larger issue here. Hate's a more extreme manifestation out of that.
So there's always going to be that divide, us versus them. That is just natural. That is just the reality of the world we live in.
The 1930s Eastern Shore, I wouldn't call it volatile, but there were socio and economic issues.
When you do not have sufficient jobs to go around, when there is scarcity of any form, during those periods of crisis, racial tensions tend to flare up.
The Eastern Shore is separated economically, geographically, from the rest of Maryland, from other parts of the United States. The Eastern Shore was very much Confederate in mind, in ideology. A University of Maryland Eastern Shore professor referred to the Eastern Shore as the Mississippi of the South. So in the 30s, you start to see the white neighbors are upset with the African American neighbors because there's greater socioeconomic issues. We think about the Great Depression that was happening. You had nothing, your neighbors had nothing, but why is it that you're a white neighbor, you're upset that your African-American neighbor maybe has something that you don't? So it starts to become this hotbed, and there's a reaction to everything that's happening. Yulee, who is also known as Orphan Jones, is the supposed confessed murderer of Green and Ivy Davis and their 2 daughters. There was a dispute between him and Green Davis. Supposedly Green Davis fired him and refused to pay him his wages. In return, Yulee supposedly murdered Green and Ivy Davis and their 2 daughters in the middle of the night with a shotgun. It was known that there was a potential dispute. Yulee was working for Green and Ivy Davis at the time, so he was their #1 suspect.
The local white population considered what was going on with the Yulee court case to be too slow. The Yulee case proceeds through several different appeals. Bernard Ades is his defense attorney, very effective, very strong defense attorney, and he knew how to appeal the first conviction, appeal it again. When Yulee was on the verge of execution, he filed an appeal with the Supreme Court. That was denied, and Yulee ultimately would be executed for a crime that he'd been convicted of.
2 years after the murder of Green and Ivy Davis and their daughters, Yulee was hanged in the county jail in Baltimore.
In the meantime, about 7 weeks after the initial murder that Yulee appears to have committed, in Salisbury, there was an incident involving a man named Matthew Williams. As one of the stories went, was in an argument with his employer over what he considered to be unfair wages. And according to this one story, he shot his employer and then attempted to shoot himself, but did not complete the act. And he wound up in the hospital here in downtown Salisbury.
He was in Peninsula General Hospital at the time. He was in the Negro Wing, which was on the 1st floor. He's hauled out of jail by a lynch mob and basically dragged through the city of Salisbury, not even a mile or so between the hospital and the courthouse lawn, where he is hanged and burned, and his body was dismembered, and there's documentation that say his fingers were cut off and thrown on the porches of the African Americans who lived not too far from that courthouse.
He was buried at a cemetery here in Salisbury, and we don't know the exact location of his grave, but he was buried in Houston Cemetery, which today is just adjacent to Route 50 in sort of the central portion of Salisbury. A couple of years later, October of 1933, there was another lynching, this time in Princess Anne, involving, again, circumstances initially that are altogether unclear, but the scapegoat for an attack.
He supposedly raped a woman.
There was an older woman in her early 70s who had reported that she'd been attacked earlier in the day and didn't identify her assailant. We just don't know exactly what happened there. But the target of the search was, again, a younger man named George Armwood, who fled, someone that had been an employer in the past, who did help him, once it was clear that he was being hunted down, helped him get to Pocomo. But he was found there and arrested. The jail in Princess Anne, a mob broke into it.
He is hanged and his body is burned. And there was just this mentality. And then so then the community comes back and say, well, someone needs to be held accountable. They went through, the Wicomico County went through 127 indictments, and they never found that any person was responsible for the murder of.
The background for all of this, again, the Yole case was still playing out at this point. And these would be the last two formally recorded lynchings in Maryland. I think the fact that we can talk about the lynchings of the 30s, I know that feels like such a small step, but the fact that the community can even start to think about it and process it, that has to be a positive sign.
Things have gotten a little bit better. We still live in a very tenuous time. What I do appreciate is that we're starting to reflect on what happened almost 100 years ago. Are they perfect? No. Will they ever be? No.
Hate is still there. Hate is still there. Prejudice is still there. Neo-Nazis, white supremacists, white nationalists, they are still there. They exist. But like I said, the reality of today is that they are in the minority. Okay? They are in the minority. Their ranks are not growing.
Every society has some degree of inequality, and that's part of the larger issue here. Hate's a more extreme manifestation out of that. But it has lessened over time, and we certainly see less prejudice and discrimination toward, members of minority groups today than we did historically. Things are much more equal.
Those actions that were taken by the lynch mob, but also the actions on behalf of the political parties, they're starting to finally react and question and wonder and try to come to a truth.
What gives me hope today is that the young ones, the ones who are growing up today, are not as prejudiced as their fathers and their grandparents. So we might get to a point in American journey, in American history, where we don't have to worry about KKK, neo-Nazi movements, and all the rest of it.
We're working toward a better goal. The Eastern Shore is trying to better itself. There are moments where there's still tension, because people are allowed to have a difference in opinion. But we see that there is still acknowledgement of Matthew Williams. We see that there's an acknowledgement of George Armwood. We see that there is an acknowledgement of Yulee.
What comes of those conversations is to be determined. So I would like to be optimistic.
We're trying to make baby steps forward, and I think if we continue to move forward, we will better the next generation. But we still have to acknowledge what actually happened, that we cannot bury, and that is genuinely important.